Hi, everybody. When Tu Diem gathered all her courage and spoke the words of a marriage proposal, her heart trembled more than it ever had before. It was not just a question of love, it was a desperate hope, a final attempt to reach the man standing before her with unfamiliar eyes. Did her proposal help Toan remember? In that fragile moment, memories hovered on the edge of his mind. Laughter, tears, promises once made. Tu Diem held her breath, wondering if love spoken aloud could awaken what time and loss had taken away. Because sometimes a single question carries an entire past and the hope of a future waiting to be remembered. Some questions are not asked with words. They are asked with courage. That evening, the house was filled with the quiet sounds of ordinary life. The soft bubbling of soup on the stove, the ticking clock on the wall, the faint chirping of insects outside. Nothing about the moment felt special, and yet Tu Diem knew her heart would remember it forever. She stood across from Toan, holding nothing in her hands. No ring, no flowers. Only a calm that came from exhaustion and love mixed together. For weeks, she had waited, for his memories, for a sign, for fate to be kind. But love, she had learned, did not always arrive when summoned. Sometimes it waited for you to move first. "Toan," she said gently, "if one day you remember everything, and if you don't, either way, would you stay?" The question lingered between them, heavier than any vow. Toan looked at her, startled. His mind searched for meaning where none appeared. Marriage was a word filled with weight, responsibility, and memories he could not touch. His chest tightened, not from rejection, but from fear. How could he promise a future when his past was missing? "I don't know who I was," he admitted quietly. "What if I become someone different?" Tu Diem smiled, though her eyes shimmered. "Then we'll meet again, like we did this time." Outside, a neighbor's radio played an old love song, half forgotten, crackling with age. Somewhere nearby, a child laughed. Life continued, unaware that a fragile decision was unfolding in a small, dimly lit room. That night, Toan could not sleep. The word marriage echoed in his mind, stirring something deep and restless. Images surfaced without warning. A woman waiting, hands trembling, a promise spoken under the same quiet sky. His head throbbed. He sat up, breath uneven, unsure whether the pain meant memory returning or something breaking apart. Tu Diem heard him moving and brought him water. She said nothing, only sat beside him. In her silence, Toan felt something unfamiliar yet comforting, a sense of home he could not explain. Was her proposal unlocking his memories, or was it simply awakening a truth his heart had never forgotten? As dawn approached, Toan stared into the fading darkness, knowing one thing for certain. Her question had changed everything. Morning came without ceremony. The sky was pale, the air cool, and the house slowly woke to the familiar rhythm of daily life. Yet for Toan, nothing felt ordinary anymore. He sat at the small wooden table, staring at a cup of tea that had long gone cold. Tu Diem moved quietly around the kitchen, careful not to disturb his thoughts. Since the night before, something inside him had shifted, subtle but undeniable, like a door left slightly open. Every sound felt sharper. The clink of dishes, the rustle of leaves outside, the distant hum of a motorbike passing by. Each one brushed against his mind, pulling at threads he didn't know how to follow. He pressed his fingers to his temple, a dull ache spreading slowly, not painful enough to stop him, but strong enough to remind him that something was trying to return. Tu Diem noticed. "You don't have to force yourself," she said softly, setting breakfast on the table. "Eat while it's warm." Her voice, gentle, familiar, sent a sudden wave through him. For a fleeting second, he saw another morning, sunlight spilling across a similar table, the same voice calling him to eat before the food got cold. His breath caught. The image vanished as quickly as it appeared, leaving behind a deep, unsettling silence. "Why does it feel like I've lived this before?" he asked. Tu Diem paused, then answered with care. "Because maybe love repeats itself, even when memory doesn't." Later that day, Toan walked through the village alone. Neighbors greeted him kindly. A woman reminded her child not to run. A man complained about tired legs after work. These ordinary scenes stirred something heavy in his chest. They felt like pieces of a life he had once belonged to, a life built on routines, shared meals, small worries, and quiet happiness. That night, sleep came in fragments. Toan dreamed of a hand slipping into his, of laughter under a dim light, of a promise spoken without witnesses. He woke with tears on his face, unable to explain why. Tu Diem sat beside him again, this time braver. She did not ask if he remembered. She did not mention marriage. She simply stayed. And in that stillness, Toan began to understand something profound. Her proposal had not forced his memories to return. It had given them a reason to come back. Whether they would fully return or not, he didn't know. But one truth was becoming clear. His heart was already answering a question his mind had yet to understand. Some memories do not return gently. They demand to be felt before they can be understood. The change came on an afternoon that seemed no different from the rest. The sun hung low, casting long shadows across the yard. Tu Diem was folding clothes when she heard a sharp sound behind her. The cup slipping from Toan's hand, shattering against the floor. He stood frozen, breathing hard. The broken pieces reflected light, like fragments of a life he could almost see. His head throbbed violently now, not a dull ache anymore, but a pounding insistence. Images rushed in without warning, rain falling hard, his own voice shouting her name, Tu Diem's tears blurring his vision as he reached for her and... "Stop!" he whispered, gripping the table. "Please, stop!" Tu Diem rushed to his side, but stopped herself from touching him. Fear flickered across her face. She knew this moment could either bring him back to her or take him away again. "I remember pain," Toan said through clenched teeth. "I remember losing something important. And I remember choosing to leave, to protect you." Her heart shattered at his words. For the first time, fragments of the truth surfaced. Not a full picture, but enough to hurt. Enough to explain why his heart felt heavy even when he smiled. Why love came to him wrapped in fear. That night, Toan finally spoke the question he had been holding back. "If I remember everything," he asked, "will I hurt you again?" Tu Diem swallowed, then shook her head gently. "We've already been hurt," she said. "What matters is whether we face it together this time." Silence filled the room. Outside, the wind rattled the windows, echoing the storm inside his mind. Toan turned away, torn between relief and terror. Memory was no longer a gift. It was a responsibility. He stepped outside alone, pacing beneath the darkening sky. Marriage, love, promises, they suddenly felt too heavy for a man still learning who he was. For the first time since returning, he considered leaving again. Tu Diem watched from the doorway, her hands trembling. She understood his fear, yet it broke her all the same. Her proposal had opened a door she couldn't close, and on the other side waited both truth and pain. As Toan looked up at the stars, one realization struck him with painful clarity. Remembering was not the hardest part. Choosing what to do with those memories would be. Love does not always arrive with certainty. Sometimes it stands quietly at the edge of forgetting, waiting to be chosen. Morning came softly, as if the world itself was afraid to wake Toan too abruptly. The sunlight slipped through the curtains and rested on his face. He opened his eyes with a strange calm, the kind that follows a long night of inner storms. His memories were still scattered, but something had shifted. The fear was no longer leading him. Curiosity was. In the kitchen, Tu Diem moved slowly, preparing breakfast the way she did every day, unremarkable on the surface, yet filled with care. This was how life had been lately, small routines stitched together by patience. She did not look up when Toan entered, unsure of what she would see in his eyes. Tu Diem? He said quietly. She turned. In his gaze, there was no sudden miracle, no full return of the past, but there was honesty, raw and unguarded. I don't remember everything, Toan admitted. There are still gaps, names, places, moments I can feel but can't touch. He paused, then added, but I remember how I feel when I'm with you. Her breath caught. He took a step closer, not as the powerful CEO he once was, but as a man standing on uncertain ground. When you asked me to marry you, I was scared, not because I don't care, but because I care more than I understand. Tu Diem's eyes filled with tears, yet she smiled. I didn't ask you to remember everything, she said softly. I asked you to stay. The room felt warmer then, as if the walls themselves were listening. Outside, neighbors passed by, laughing, arguing, living their ordinary lives. It reminded them both that love wasn't meant to be dramatic all the time. It was meant to survive mornings like this. Toan reached for her hand. His grip was steady. I choose you, he said, even if my memories come back slowly, even if some never return. I want to build new ones with you. In that moment, Tu Diem understood something simple yet profound. Memory may fade, but choice does not. Love is not what we remember. It is what we decide to do every day. As they stood together in the quiet kitchen, no grand music played, no past fully returned, but a future, fragile and hopeful, began to take shape. And sometimes that is the strongest kind of remembering.